The cold bit through the thick leather of his flight jacket, a familiar, almost comforting sensation. Oberleutnant Dieter Baumann, at 26 years old, already bore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves at his throat, and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many sunrises over hostile territory. From the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G-6, the world was a monochrome expanse of early morning sky and the dark, rolling forests of western Germany below. The date was December 5, 1943. The time, 7:18. His breath fogged the inside of his oxygen mask with each measured exhale. Through his headset crackled the voice of his wingman, Unteroffizier Karl Voss. "Anything on your side, Dieter? My fingers are starting to think they're part of the stick." Baumann allowed himself a thin smile, scanning the empty, pale blue dome. "Nothing, Karl, just us and the frost. Maybe the Amis are still in bed, dreaming of their coffee and eggs." The joke was an old one, a staple of their Jagdschwader 26 Schlageter. It spoke of a deeply ingrained belief. The Americans were capable, yes, but they were predictable. They flew their missions with a clockwork regularity that German fighter controllers had learned to exploit. They favored tight, defensible formations of their heavy bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, and their fighter escorts, when they appeared at all, were usually those cumbersome, radial-engined thunderbolts. Good for a straight line, perhaps, but no match for the agile 109 in a turning fight. Baumann had 11 confirmed victories against American aircraft. He had never been shot down. He adjusted the rheostat on his instrument panel, dimming the soft green glow. His eyes, perpetually scanning, saw nothing but the vastness. Yet a small, persistent knot of unease sat in his gut, unrelated to the mission. It was the briefings. For weeks now, there had been murmurs. Strange reports filtering back from the Channel coast and from the bomber interception missions deeper into the Reich. Talk of a new American fighter, a long-nosed, sleek machine that could appear at altitudes previously thought safe. The intelligence officers at the Jederstab had dismissed them. "Propaganda," they'd said. "Pilot error in the heat of combat. The Americans have nothing that can outclimb or outrun a Gustav at 30,000 feet." The official line was that the P-38 Lightning was their only true high-altitude threat, and it was a complicated, twin-engine target. The P-47 was a flying tank, and the P-51, well, the early Allison-engined Mustangs they'd encountered over deep had been mediocre at best. Baumann wanted to believe the briefings. His survival depended on knowing his enemy. But the stories from veterans he trusted, men with 50, 60 kills, had a ring of terrified truth to them. "Schlange 2, Schlange leader, check your fuel." The calm voice of their swarm leader, Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, no relation to the famous ace, cut through his thoughts. Hartmann was a careful, meticulous pilot, not given to exaggeration. "We'll patrol for another 20 minutes, then head back to Dortmund. Looks like another quiet one." "Understood, leader," Baumann responded, his gloved hand moving to the fuel selector switch. He had enough for another hour, easy. The mission was a standing patrol along what the Luftwaffe maps called Reichsverteidigung Zone 7, a vast swath of airspace protecting the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Their job was to intercept any early raid penetrations, to break up bomber streams before they reached their targets. It was defensive, reactive warfare, a far cry from the heady days of 1940 over England. But it was still a fight they believed they could win. Man for man, plane for plane, the German pilot was still superior. That was the article of faith. What Dieter Baumann could not know, as his Messerschmitt carved a silent, frozen arc through the stratosphere, was that the calculus of air superiority over Europe was being rewritten not in a briefing room in Berlin, but on factory floors in Inglewood, California, and in design offices in Buffalo, New York. And the instrument of this change was already in the air, climbing through the cold December haze 50 miles to the west, its pilot scanning his own radar screen for the telltale blips that would confirm a contact. The reports Baumann's commanders had dismissed were not just accurate. They were understated, and in less than 15 minutes, everything Dieter Baumann thought he knew about aerial combat would be rendered obsolete. The confidence of the German fighter arm in late 1943 was not baseless arrogance. It was built upon a formidable edifice of proven success and technical achievement. Since the Spanish Civil War, the Luftwaffe had perfected the art of the tactical fighter sweep and the bomber interception. Pilots like Werner Mölders and Adolf Galland had developed tactics that maximized the strengths of their aircraft. The energy-fighting boom and zoom that utilized the Messerschmitt's excellent rate of climb and dive speed. By 1943, the Bf 109, in its G-series Gustav variant, was a known quantity, a thoroughbred bred for speed and altitude. Armed with a 20 cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13 machine guns in the cowling, it packed a lethal punch. Its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced 1,475 horsepower, propelling it to over 400 miles per hour. In the hands of an expert, it was a deadly weapon. German intelligence assessments of American capabilities were a patchwork of captured documents, intercepted radio traffic, and agent reports, most of which were months out of date. A key report from the WWII, dated August 1943, estimated total U.S. fighter production at approximately 800 units per month, with heavy emphasis on naval types for the Pacific. The figure was shockingly, catastrophically wrong. It failed to account for the sheer, explosive growth of American industry. While German factories, under constant threat of bombing, struggled to produce 600 Bf 109s a month across all variants, American plants were achieving something unimaginable. At Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island, workers were rolling out a completed P-47 Thunderbolt every hour. North American Aviation in Inglewood was approaching a similar rate with its new fighter, the P-51. The WWII's number was off by a factor of 3, and climbing. This intelligence failure was compounded by cultural and doctrinal blinders. The Luftwaffe High Command, men like Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch and General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, were products of a system that valued individual pilot skill and tactical innovation above all else. They looked at the tight, unwieldy combat boxes of B-17s and saw a lack of flexibility. They engaged American fighters and noted a tendency toward rigid adherence to bomber escort doctrine, a reluctance to break formation and engage in the swirling, individualistic dogfights that German aces thrived on. The conclusion drawn was that the American pilot, while brave and well-equipped, lacked the Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feeling, of his German counterpart. He was a technician, not a warrior artist. This prejudice seeped into every level. A captured USAAF interrogation report from a downed German pilot, filed in October 1943, contained the dismissive assessment. The enemy pilots exhibit good discipline but poor initiative. They are tied to their bombers like puppies on a leash. On paper, the technical comparisons seem to validate German confidence. Luftwaffe manuals contain performance charts for known Allied aircraft. The P-47D Thunderbolt was listed with a top speed of 433 mph at 30,000 feet. The Bf 109 G-6 was rated at 428 mph at 22,000 feet. The charts noted the Thunderbolt's tremendous weight, over 10,000 pounds empty, nearly double that of the 109, and concluded it would be sluggish in climb and maneuverability. The early model P-51A with its Allison engine was listed as dangerous at low altitude, ineffective above 15,000 feet. The assumption was that high-altitude supremacy would remain with the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The escort fighters would have to turn back, leaving the bombers naked for the killing stroke. This was the foundational premise of the entire Reichsverteidigung strategy, but there were dissenting voices, and they were being systematically ignored. One of the most prescient was Oberstleutnant Gustav Rödel, a gruff, respected Jesuiter commodore with over 90 victories. In a confidential memo to the Inspector of Fighters in September 1943, he wrote, "Recent engagements with enemy escort fighters, particularly a new type resembling an elongated P-51, indicate a radical improvement in high-altitude performance. Our tactical advantage of altitude is being neutralized. I strongly recommend immediate acceleration of the Ta-152 high-altitude program and priority for the DB-605D engine with improved superchargers." The memo was acknowledged, then filed away. The high-altitude specialist Focke-Wulf Ta-152 existed only as a handful of prototypes. The engine upgrades were delayed by bombing raids on the Daimler-Benz plants. Rödel's warning was a ripple in a pond that the High Command refused to believe was about to become a tidal wave. The American secret weapon was not a single piece of technology, but a devastating combination of industrial might, engineering pragmatism, and a specific, war-winning innovation that had been born out of sheer necessity. While German designers chased exotic, complex solutions like the Me-262 jet, American engineers focused on perfecting the piston engine to its absolute limit. And at the heart of this effort was a man named Edgar Schmude and a company called North American Aviation. Schmude, a German-born aeronautical engineer who had emigrated to the United States in 1930, was the chief designer of the P-51. The initial Allison-engined Mustang had been a good ground attack plane, but its performance fell off sharply above medium altitude, making it useless as a bomber escort over Germany. The transformation began in 1942, almost by accident. A British test pilot, Ronald Harker, flew the P-51A and was impressed by its sleek airframe. He had a radical suggestion. What if you married this beautiful, low-drag fuselage to the most powerful high-altitude engine the British had, the Rolls-Royce Merlin? The Merlin, the engine that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster, was a liquid-cooled V-12 masterpiece, renowned for its performance at altitude. North American and Rolls-Royce engineers collaborated in a transatlantic frenzy. They redesigned the Mustang's nose to accept the Merlin, added a new, efficient radiator system that actually produced a small amount of thrust, and created the P-51 billion. The numbers were revolutionary. The Packard-built Merlin V-1650-3 engine delivered 1,380 horsepower at takeoff, but its true genius was its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and most engines gasp for breath, the Merlin supercharger compressed the thin air twice, forcing it into the cylinders with the density of air at sea level. The result was a fighter that didn't just perform at altitude, it thrived there. Test flights in the summer of 1943 revealed a machine capable of 440 mph at 30,000 feet, with a climb rate that could match a Bf-109G, and a range that was nothing short of miraculous. Range was the second, equally critical part of the equation. The USAAF's bomber commanders, like Major General Jimmy Doolittle, were desperate. Their unescorted daylight raids into Germany were suffering catastrophic losses, 25% on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943. The bombers needed an escort that could go all the way to Berlin and back. The P-47, with its thirsty radial engine, couldn't do it. The P-38 had the range but was complex and vulnerable in certain regimes of flight. The Mustang's sleek, laminar flow wing was not just fast, it was incredibly efficient. Engineers then made a simple, brutal modification. They installed a fuselage fuel tank behind the pilot's seat, increasing internal fuel capacity to 269 gallons. Then they added underwing pylons for two 75-gallon or, later, 110-gallon drop tanks. The mathematics of distance changed overnight. A P-51 billion with two 75-gallon drop tanks could fly 475 miles to a target, loiter for 30 minutes, and fly 475 miles back. It could go to Berlin. It could go past Berlin. While German intelligence was obsessing over production numbers of a plane they considered inferior, the industrial machine was gearing up to produce this new weapon in stupefying quantities. North America's Inglewood plant was a cathedral of production. Using techniques pioneered by the automotive industry, subassembly lines, female riveters, Rosie the Riveter was not a myth. Round-the-clock shifts, the plant moved from a trickle to a flood. In January 1943, they produced 50 P-51Bs. By January 1944. That number would be 250. A second plant in Dallas, Texas, would soon come online, doubling the output. This wasn't just production, it was mass production on a scale Germany could not comprehend. They built fighters like they were Fords, and each one that rolled off the line was not a copy, but an improvement. The P-51C was identical to the B, but built in Dallas. The next variant, the P-51D, already on the drawing board, would feature a breathtaking bubble canopy for all-around vision and 650 caliber machine guns instead of 4. The process was iterative, relentless, and fueled by an economy untouched by war. The men who flew them were changing, too. The early green pilots of 1942 were being replaced by a new generation, blooded in the skies over France and the Low Countries. They were learning, adapting. Tacticians like Colonel Hubert Hub Zemk, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, were developing new ways to fight. They studied German tactics and created countertactics. They learned to use the Thunderbolt's incredible dive speed to disengage. And they were beginning to understand how to use the Mustang's combination of speed, range, and maneuverability to take the fight to the Jagdflieger on their own terms. The puppies on a leash were being trained as wolves, and they were about to be unleashed with a weapon their keepers didn't believe existed. The first, fragmentary signs of this new reality began to pierce the Luftwaffe's consciousness in the autumn of 1943, but like faint radio signals through static, they were misinterpreted, dismissed, or simply not believed. On October 14, 1943, the infamous Black Thursday, 2nd Schweinfurt raid, a returning FW-190 pilot of JG-1, Lieutenant Franz Stigler, reported a bizarre encounter. After breaking through the first layer of Thunderbolts, we reformed for a second pass on the bomber stream. At approximately 28,000 feet, I observed 3 single-engine fighters approaching from the west at high speed. Their profile was unfamiliar, long nose, single tail, wing shape unlike a P-47. They closed rapidly, too rapidly for Thunderbolts at that altitude. I broke off my attack and turned to engage. In the turning fight, I found I could not gain an angle. They matched my turn, and their speed in the climb was exceptional. I disengaged with difficulty. His Gruppenkommandeur, a veteran of the Eastern Front with over 100 kills, scribbled in the margin of the after-action report. Probable misidentification. Likely encountered late-model Spitfires Mk.IX, stress of combat. The report was filed under Allied fighter types unconfirmed. A week later, a more concrete piece of evidence fell into German hands, but its significance was lost. A P-51 billion of the 354th Fighter Group, its pilot forced to bail out over Holland due to engine trouble, crashed almost intact in a farmer's field. The wreckage was quickly recovered by the Technische Amt, the Luftwaffe's technical intelligence branch. Engineers pored over the airframe. They noted the elegant laminar flow wing, the streamlined fuselage, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine clearly marked Packard. A detailed report was sent to Berlin, concluding, the captured aircraft represents a significant advance in American fighter design, particularly in aerodynamic efficiency. Performance estimates based on the airframe and engine suggest high-altitude capabilities approaching those of the Bf-109G. This should have been a 5-alarm fire. Instead, the report was categorized as interesting technical data and circulated among a small group of designers. The operational commands, the men who would have to fight this thing, never saw it. The assumption remained that this was a specialized, limited production aircraft, not the vanguard of a fleet. By November, the whispers among the frontline pilots became a steady murmur of concern. Casualty rates, which had been manageable, began to creep upward in certain units assigned to intercept the deepest penetrations. Veteran aces, men who had survived hundreds of sorties, began to fail to return from missions where the bomber streams were accompanied by the long-nosed ones. The official explanations were always the same: flak, bomber defensive fire chance. The idea that an American fighter could best a seasoned expert in a fair fight was still anathema. The psychological barrier was as formidable as any technological one. To accept that the enemy had a superior machine was to accept that the war in the air might be lost. It was easier to blame bad luck, or the overwhelming numbers of bombers, or the strain of continuous combat. One man who tried desperately to connect the dots was Major Hans-Heinrich Brustellen, a staff officer in the Luftwaffe's Operational Intelligence Branch. A former bomber pilot with a logical mind, he began collating loss reports from October and November 1943. He noticed a pattern. Losses spiked disproportionately on days when USAAF bomber raids were accompanied by effective fighter escort reported. Cross-referencing these with reconnaissance photos of English airfields, he identified a new type of fighter parked in rows at bases like Debden and Bodny. He compiled a dossier marked GHIMEKOMMANDOSACHE, top secret, and sent it directly to General der Jagdflieger office in early December. It stated, bluntly, "Evidence suggests the enemy has deployed a new high-performance, long-range escort fighter in significant numbers. It is compromising our ability to effectively intercept bomber formations. Immediate tactical and technical countermeasures are required." The dossier was received, acknowledged, and then buried under the avalanche of more immediate crises: the Eastern Front collapsing, production shortages, the threat of invasion in the West. Brustellen's warning was the canary in the coal mine, but the miners were too busy arguing about the type of canary to notice it had stopped singing. All these disparate threads, the dismissed reports, the captured wreckage, the rising losses, the ignored intelligence assessment, were about to be woven together into a single, horrifying tapestry of reality for Dieter Baumann and the pilots of JG-26. The moment of truth was not coming in a briefing room. It was climbing through 25,000 feet, 50 miles west of his position, its pilot, Captain John T. Godfrey of the 336th Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, peering through his new bubble canopy and listening to the voice of his controller vectoring him toward a bandit contact. "Blue Leader, this is Bunting Control. Paint shows multiple bandits, Angels 25, bearing 0905, range 50 miles. Estimate strength 1+ swarm. You are cleared to engage." Godfrey's voice was calm, flat. "Roger, Bunting. Blue Flight arm guns. Drop tanks on my mark. Under the wings of the 4 P-51Bs, the empty 75-gallon fuel tanks fell away, tumbling into the void. The Mustangs, suddenly lighter, seemed to leap forward. Godfrey pushed the throttle smoothly to the gate, the Merlin behind him roaring with a deep, powerful song, the supercharger kicking in with a solid thump as it shifted into high blower. The needle on the airspeed indicator began to climb past 300, past 350. They were in their element. At 7:33, Dieter Baumann's unease crystallized into a sharp, professional focus. "Contact 10 o'clock high," Hartmann's voice announced, devoid of its earlier casual tone. Baumann's head snapped up. Against the lightning blue he saw them, 4 specks slightly above, maybe 2 kilometers away. The profile was wrong. They were too slender, the wings too straight and narrow to be thunderbolts. They didn't have the twin-boom silhouette of lightnings. New contacts, Baumann said, his voice tight. Not thunderbolts. Profile unknown. Probably more of those photo reconnaissance mosquitoes, Voss chimed in, trying to sound confident. We can run them down. Hartman didn't answer immediately. He was studying them. They weren't running. They were turning, not away, but toward them, and they were gaining altitude relative to the 109s. That was impossible unless they had a significant energy advantage. A cold trickle of doubt, the first real fear, traced its way down Baumann's spine. The briefings had said nothing could outclimb them here. Swarm, break by pairs, Hartman ordered, his voice still calm but now edged with steel. Engage. Watch for others. The four Messerschmitts broke into two elements, Hartman and his wingman climbing to meet the threat head-on, Baumann and Voss swinging wide to the right to set up a flanking attack. It was standard swarm tactic, perfected over years of combat. Baumann pushed his throttle forward, the DB-605 responding with a high-pitched whine. He kept his eyes on the four strangers. As the distance closed, details emerged. The sleek, almost predatory lines, the single, large propeller, the unmistakable shape of a Mustang, but a Mustang like he'd never seen. This one had a huge, clear canopy, offering the pilot a panoramic view, and it was fast. He could see it now, eating up the sky between them. Hartman's element made the first pass, a high-speed slashing attack from above. The German tactic was to use their altitude, fire a burst, and use their dive speed to escape before the heavier enemy could turn. Baumann watched, his mouth dry. The lead Mustang saw the attack coming. Instead of turning away or trying to follow the diving 109s, it simply pulled its nose up into a breathtaking, near-vertical climb. The other three followed. Hartman's bullets passed harmlessly behind them. The Mustangs didn't dive after Hartman. They continued climbing, reversing their direction at the top of the climb with a crisp, rolling turn that spoke of superb energy retention. They were now above and behind Hartman's element, which was struggling to regain altitude after its dive. "Leader, break right. They're on your tail," Baumann yelled, shoving his own stick forward to dive to the aid of his commander. He and Voss rolled in, gunsights centering on the trailing Mustang. At 400 meters, Baumann squeezed the trigger. The 109 shuddered as the 20 cannon and machine guns spat fire and smoke. He saw his tracers arc toward the enemy fighter. What happened next defied every expectation, every line in every Luftwaffe manual. The Mustang pilot didn't break into a hard, energy-shedding turn. He simply rolled inverted and pulled his nose through the vertical into a splittess, diving away with an acceleration that seemed physically impossible. Baumann's round sliced through empty air. Voss, following him, tried to track the diving target but lost it almost instantly. The Mustang had vanished, converting its altitude back into speed at a rate that left the 109 standing still. "Mein Gott," Voss breathed over the radio. "Did you see that?" Baumann didn't have time to answer. A warning shout from Hartman. "Schlange 2, break left, break left." Baumann yanked the stick hard left, his body crushing into the side of the cockpit from the G-forces. A stream of tracers, not the orange golf balls of German cannon shells, but the faster, finer streaks of .50 caliber bullets, zipped past his canopy, so close he could hear their distinctive ripping telegraph paper sound. He caught a glimpse in his mirror. A Mustang, the one he'd just fired at, was already climbing back up behind him, having completed its dive and zoom climb in what seemed like seconds. The energy maneuverability was staggering. This wasn't a heavy fighter, it was a ghost, a phantom that could be anywhere. The radio, once a channel for terse commands, erupted into chaos. "I can't shake him, he's too fast in the climb." Where did the other two go? Hartman's hit. "I see smoke." "Voss, Karl, get out of there." Baumann risked a glance over his shoulder. Voss's 109 was trailing a thin wisp of smoke, a Mustang glued to its tail. He saw Voss jink violently, but the Mustang matched every move, closing the distance with terrifying patience. Then, a flicker of fire from the Mustang's wings. Not the short, chattering bursts of a nervous pilot, but a long, sustained 6-second torrent from 6 guns. The air around Voss's aircraft seemed to fill with a solid cone of lead. Pieces flew off the tail, then the wing root. The 109 snapped into a spin, a plume of dark smoke marking its descent. "Carl," Baumann screamed, but there was no response, just static. He was alone. Hartmann was gone, his wingman was gone, Voss was gone. The fight had lasted less than 2 minutes. He craned his neck, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw one Mustang, then another, circling high above like hawks. They weren't pursuing him aggressively, they were regrouping. They had the altitude, they had the speed, they had the initiative. He was low, slow, and alone. The tactical mastery was absolute. These were not the hesitant escorts of 6 months ago. These pilots fought with a cold, confident aggression, using their aircraft's strengths with surgical precision. Then, from the west, he saw them. Not just the original 4. More specks growing larger by the second. Not a swarm, not even a staffel. It looked like an entire grup. Dozens of them, stacked in layers, their polished metal skins glinting in the rising sun. They weren't just escorting a bomber stream. They were sweeping the sky ahead of it, clearing a path with overwhelming force. The intelligence reports, the dismissed warnings, Brustellan's dossier, it all crashed down upon him in that single, horrifying moment of clarity. This was not an anomaly. This was the new normal. The Americans hadn't just built a better fighter, they had built hundreds of them and they had learned how to use them. His fuel warning light blinked on, a dull yellow eye on his panel. He was miles inside German airspace, but he felt more exposed and vulnerable than he ever had over the English Channel. One of the high-flying Mustangs tipped its wing and began a shallow dive in his direction. It wasn't a frantic attack. It was a leisurely, confident intercept. The pilot knew Baumann had nowhere to run. Baumann shoved the throttle to the emergency war power setting, the engine screaming in protest. He turned east, toward home, diving to build speed. The cold air whistled past his canopy. He checked his mirror. The Mustang was still there, growing larger, closing the gap with effortless speed. It wasn't even in firing range yet. It was just following, waiting. The message was clear. You are not in control of this engagement. The ground below began to rise as he approached the Ruhr Valley. Smoke from 1,000 factory chimneys smudged the horizon. His airfield was somewhere in that haze, maybe 10 minutes away at this speed. 10 minutes was an eternity. He could hear the steady, powerful drone of the Merlin engine behind him now, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He keyed his radio, his voice a hoarse croak. "Dortmund Control, this is Schlange 2. Emergency. I am under attack by enemy fighters, multiple bandits. Request immediate assistance." "My position," the radio crackled. Then a calm, almost bored American voice cut in on the same frequency. "Hey, Hans, you might want to look at your 9 o'clock before you finish that call." Baumann's blood turned to ice. He jerked his head to the left. Another P-51D, its nose painted a bright yellow, was sliding into formation with him, barely 50 yards off his wingtip. He could see the pilot clearly through the bubble canopy, a young man with an oxygen mask who gave him a casual 2-fingered wave. Then the American pointed downward, a clear command. Land, or else. The first Mustang, the one on his tail, was now well within firing range. Baumann was trapped in a vice of his own making, caught between 2 enemies who held every advantage. He had 2 choices. Try to fight, which would be suicide, or obey and become a prisoner. His hand trembled on the stick. The Knight's Cross at his throat felt like a lead weight. The arrogance of minutes ago was ashes in his mouth. He looked ahead toward the smudge of Dortmund. Then he looked back at the yellow-nosed Mustang on his wing, its pilot watching him, waiting for his decision. The engine of the fighter behind him deepened its note, a final, ominous warning. Dieter Baumann took a deep, shuddering breath. His eyes fixed on the impossible, beautiful, terrifying machine keeping pace with him, as if they were on a peacetime training flight. He reached for the throttle, his mind racing. the reality of his situation crashing down with the weight of 1,000 falling drop tanks. The Americans weren't just here. They owned the sky. And as his fingers closed around the throttle lever, the yellow-nosed Mustang's pilot gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if he already knew what the German would do. The nod wasn't a gesture of camaraderie, but of absolute, unassailable control. It was the final confirmation of the new order. Bauman's fingers, numb inside his gloves, did not pull the throttle back to fight. Instead, with a movement that felt like tearing a piece of his own soul out, he pushed the throttle forward, cut the mixture to idle, and began a gentle, shallow descent. He lowered his landing gear. The Messerschmitt shuddered as the wheels locked down, a white flag in the language of aviation. The yellow-nosed Mustang stayed with him, a perfect, menacing escort. The one behind dropped back slightly but remained in position, a shepherd's dog ensuring the sheep didn't bolt. The world through the canopy became a blur of shame and surreal clarity. He could see the details of the American aircraft now, the slightly weathered olive drab paint, the tiny stencils, the exhaust stains along the cowling. He saw the pilot's eyes visible above the oxygen mask. They were calm, watchful, utterly professional. There was no gloating, no triumphant gesture. This was just a job efficiently done. That indifference was more devastating than any hatred could have been. Below, the patchwork of fields and forests gave way to the outskirts of a small town. Bauman spotted a long, straight stretch of road, the Reichsautobahn, built for the glory of the Thousand-Year Reich, now to serve as his prison yard. He lined up on it, his mind detached, operating on pure muscle memory. The wheels touched the concrete with a screech and a series of jarring bumps. He rolled to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying. Silence broken only by the whistle of the wind and the approaching, then fading, roar of the two Mustangs as they climbed away, their work complete. He sat there in the middle of the Autobahn, the cockpit suddenly stifling. He ripped off his oxygen mask and vomited onto the floor. The metallic taste of fear mixed with the acid in his throat. He fumbled with the canopy release, needing air, needing to escape the tomb of his failure. The canopy slid back and the cold morning air washed over him, carrying the distant, droning thunder of 1,000 engines. He looked up. The sky, once his domain, was now a vast, moving tapestry of American power. High above, contrails crisscrossed in a grid, the bomber streams heading east, deep into the heart of the Reich. And weaving around them, glittering like minnows around whales, were the fighters. Not just a few, scores of them, perhaps hundreds. The sight was biblical in its scale, a force of nature against which his lone knight's cross was a pathetic trinket. Farmers and townspeople emerged from nearby houses, staring at the fighter on their road. Their faces held curiosity, then dawning horror as they saw the black crosses. A boy pointed westward at the armada in the sky. Dieter Baumann, Oberleutnant, holder of the oak leaves, unbuckled his harness with trembling hands and climbed out onto the wing. He did not look at the people. He stared at his aircraft, the sleek lines of the Bf 109G-6 that had been an extension of his will for so long. It seemed suddenly small, frail, a relic. He removed his pistol from its holster and dropped it into the cockpit. Then he sat on the wing root, head in his hands, and waited for the authorities to come and take him away. The war, for him, was over. It had ended in exactly 6 minutes of combat. But the end for Dieter Baumann was merely the beginning of the reckoning for the Luftwaffe. What he had experienced was not a unique misfortune, but the opening act of a systemic collapse that would unfold with terrifying speed across every front of the air war. While Baumann sat shivering on his wing, the rest of the mission unfolded with a brutal, mathematical inevitability. The swarm from JG-26 had been one tiny element in a complex defensive web. That morning, Luftwaffe Reich had scrambled 187 single-engine fighters to intercept the incoming raid targeting Frankfurt. Of those 187, only 39 would make effective contact with the bomber stream. The rest were intercepted, harried, and broken up by the fighter sweeps of P-51s that roamed 50 miles ahead of the bombers, free hunting. The Mustangs, operating with full internal fuel and drop tanks, could afford to spend an hour over Germany before the bombers even arrived, systematically clearing the skies. The statistics from that single day, December 5, 1943, would later be pored over by Luftwaffe analysts with mounting dread. They lost 31 fighters destroyed and 15 damaged beyond repair. They claimed 8 bombers and 4 fighters. The loss ratio was nearly 4-1 in the Americans' favor. More devastating than the numbers was the nature of the losses. Of the 31 pilots lost, 19 were experienced staffel or swarm leaders, men with hundreds of combat hours. These were the irreplaceable core of the fighter arm. The new American tactic wasn't just to shoot down planes, it was to decapitate units. Across the channel, at Debden Airfield, the mood was one of grim satisfaction. Captain John Godfrey, the leader of the flight that had decimated Bauman's swarm, debriefed with his intelligence officer. "They flew right into it," he said, drawing lines on a map. "Standard 2-pair break. We had the altitude, we had the sun. It was over before they knew what hit them. Their aircraft seem slower, or maybe ours are just that much faster." The technical report filed that night noted laconically, P-51 billion performance superior to Bf-109G in all regimes above 20,000 feet. Enemy tactics appear outdated. The shockwaves from encounters like these rippled through the German fighter force at every level. In the officers' mess at Jever, home of JG-1, pilots who had survived the October and November battles argued over schnapps. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, the pilot whose report had been dismissed in October, slammed his glass on the table. I told the Idioten in Berlin they weren't Spitfires. They have the nose of a Mustang and they climb like the devil, and now they're everywhere." A veteran Oberleutnant with 60 victories shook his head. "It is the numbers, France. You cannot fight physics. They have more of everything. More fuel, more speed, more ammunition. We are being smothered." The desperate attempts at adaptation began immediately, but they were like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. Technical orders were rushed to frontline units. One, dated December 10, 1943, mandated the removal of the 20 cannon gondolas under the wings of the Bf-109G-6, the so-called gun pods. These had been added to increase firepower against heavy bombers, but they reduced speed by 25 mph and degraded maneuverability catastrophically. The order read, "In light of increased encounters with high-performance enemy escorts, all units are to remove Unterflügelwaffenbehälter to restore dogfighting capability." It was a tacit admission that the primary mission was no longer killing bombers, but surviving the fighters that protected them. Another order, from General der Jagdflieger Galland himself, circulated on December 15. It was a masterpiece of understated desperation. "The Reichsmarschall has directed that henceforth primary emphasis in fighter engagements is to be on the destruction of the enemy's escort fighters. The destruction of the bomber can only be achieved after local air superiority is won." This was a complete inversion of German fighter doctrine, which had always held the bomber as the primary target. But it was an impossible order. German fighters, stripped of their heavy armament to fight other fighters, then lacked the punch to quickly kill a B-17. And the Mustangs, with their superior performance, could dictate the terms of every engagement. The intelligence post-mortem on the December battles finally disinterred Major Brustellen's buried dossier. A panicked conference was called at the Luftwaffe High Command's headquarters at Wildparkwerder on December 20. Generaloberst Hans Jeskinek, the chief of the General Staff, presided over a room of grim faces. Brustellen was ordered to present his findings. He laid out photographs of P-51Bs on English airfields, performance graphs comparing the Merlin Mustang to the Bf-109G, and loss charts that showed a vertical climb beginning in mid-November. "The enemy fighter," Brustelin stated, his voice echoing in the silent room, designated P-51 billion and C, has a combat radius we estimate at 475 miles. This means it can escort bombers to any target in Germany. Its high-altitude performance equals or exceeds that of our best interceptors. Our previous tactical advantage, attacking the bombers after their escorts turn back, no longer exists. They are now with them all the way to the target and back. Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch, the man responsible for aircraft production, stared at the graphs. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Intelligence from Abwehr sources suggests production rates of 300 per month, possibly more," Brustelin replied. A murmur of disbelief ran through the room. A senior staff officer from the technical branch spoke up. "That is not possible. The airframe is too complex. The engine this Merlin, it requires precision machining we can barely manage for our own DB-605. "Nevertheless," Brustelin said, pointing to reconnaissance photos showing rows of identical fighters, "the evidence is here. They are not building them like aircraft. They are building them like cooking pots." The conference ended with a series of frantic directives. Priority was given to the Focke-Wulf Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet program was to be accelerated at all costs. But these were long-term solutions. The Ta-152 existed only as 3 flying prototypes. The Me-262 was plagued by engine reliability issues, and critically, a shortage of the special heat-resistant metals needed for its jet turbines. Hitler himself had recently insisted it be built as a fast bomber, further delaying its deployment as a fighter. The minutes of the meeting concluded with a stark sentence: "Interim solutions must be found to counter the P-51 threat in the next 3 months, or the daylight defense of the Reich will become unsustainable." But the Americans were not waiting. The interim was already over. The perspective of the German fighter pilot shifted from one of hunter to hunted in the span of a single winter. The diary of Lieutenant Helmut Lenartz, a pilot with JG-11, entry dated January 11, 1944, captures the psychological toll. "Flew 2 missions today. The first, we were vectored onto a bomber stream near Hanover. We never saw the bombers. We were jumped by Mustangs at 28,000 feet. They came out of the sun in a dive. Fischer was hit in the first pass. I saw his aircraft come apart. No parachute. We scattered. I dove for the deck using the old trick. I looked back at 5,000 feet. 2 of them were still with me, just circling above. They did not follow me down. They did not need to. They owned the heights. I landed at a forward field with barely 10 liters of fuel. The second mission was aborted when control warned of strong fighter presence ahead of the bombers. We turned back. We are no longer defending the Reich. We are hiding from it." The physical toll was quantified in cold, hard numbers that even the most optimistic commander could not ignore. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 411 single-engine fighters in the defense of the Reich. In February, that number rose to 489. Pilot casualties exceeded 1,000 for the 2-month period. The training schools, already compressed and hampered by fuel shortages, could not hope to replace them. The average experience level of a German fighter pilot plummeted. Where in 1943, a new pilot might join a squadron with a veteran leader who had 50 or more victories, by early 1944, he was likely to be led by someone with only a dozen. The institutional memory of the Luftwaffe was being erased, sortie by sortie. The impact was felt far beyond the borders of Germany. In the Mediterranean theater, the same P-51s, operating from Italian bases, began to appear over the Balkans and southern Austria. On February 22, 1944, a massive raid on the aircraft factories at Regensburg was escorted all the way by Mustangs of the 31st Fighter Group. German interceptors from JG-3 and JG-27 attempted to attack, but were savaged by the escorts. The after-action report from JG-3 noted, "The enemy escorts were exceptionally aggressive and prevented any coordinated attack on the bomber formation. Losses were severe." The Regensburg factory, vital for Bf-109 production, was heavily damaged. It was a vicious cycle. The Mustangs protected the bombers that were destroying the factories that built the fighters needed to fight the Mustangs. The technological admiration from the German side was laced with a sense of bitter irony. When a second P-51 billion was captured relatively intact in March 1944 after forced landing in Belgium, it was subjected to an exhaustive evaluation by the Technische Amt at Richlin. The chief engineer, Professor Heinrich Hertel, a brilliant aerodynamicist, wrote a report that was a eulogy for German technical supremacy. "The aircraft represents a near-perfect marriage of airframe and engine," he wrote. "The laminar flow wing, while difficult to manufacture consistently, offers a drag coefficient approximately 20% lower than our best designs. The Meredith effect radiator installation is a work of genius. It actually contributes thrust at cruise speed. The two-stage supercharger on the Packard Merlin is mechanically simpler and more effective at extreme altitude than our DB600 and 5 single-stage system. Most importantly, the design is optimized for mass production. The airframe is built in subassemblies with extensive use of stamped parts and spot welding, techniques we reserve for transport aircraft. The Americans have not built the best fighter in the world. They have built a very good fighter that can be produced in overwhelming numbers. That is the true innovation, and it is one we cannot match." He concluded with a devastating comparison. To produce one Bf-109 G-6 requires 48 man-hours. Based on analysis of the captured aircraft and intelligence on their production methods, we estimate a P-51 billion requires less than 32 man-hours. They build them faster, with less skilled labor, and they build more of them. This is not a problem of aeronautics. It is a problem of economics. The economic reality was a sledgehammer against which tactical brilliance was useless. While German industry, scattered and under relentless bombardment, struggled to produce 1,200 fighters of all types in the first quarter of 1944, American factories produced over 45 P-51s and P-47s alone. The United States was not just outproducing Germany, it was outproducing the entire Axis combined by a factor of 5. This industrial tsunami manifested in the skies over Europe as a simple, crushing reality. For every German fighter that took off, there were now 5 Allied fighters waiting for it. For the men on the ground, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht preparing for the inevitable invasion in the West, the changing of the guard in the skies was a daily, demoralizing spectacle. A panzer commander in Normandy, Hauptmann von Luck, wrote in a letter to his wife in April 1944, "We watch them every day, the American Jabos, fighter-bombers. They arrive with the morning light and stay until dusk. They are not like the Stukas, which come and go. They own the sky. My men are becoming afraid to move in daylight. A single vehicle on a road is enough to attract them. We have lost 3 trucks and a half-track this week to strafing. We cannot fight what we cannot see until it is too late. The enemy has put a roof over France, and it is made of airplanes." The final, strategic consequence of this air superiority was the successful launch of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, on June 6, 1944. The Luftwaffe's response was pitifully weak. Only 319 sorties were flown over the invasion beaches on that critical day by the entire German Air Force in the West. They claimed a handful of ships, but lost over 100 aircraft. The Allies flew over 13,000 sorties. The reason was not a lack of German will, but the effectiveness of the pre-invasion air campaign, executed by the very long-range fighters whose existence Berlin had once denied. For months, P-51s and P-47s had systematically attacked Luftwaffe airfields in France, destroying planes on the ground, cratering runways, and shooting down any aircraft that dared to take off. By D-Day, the once formidable air power in France had been reduced to a skeletal force. The roof over Normandy was not just strong, it had been built by clearing away all opposition. The personal arc of Dieter Baumann, the man who had first glimpsed the coming storm, intersected with this strategic reality in a prisoner-of-war camp in England. Transferred from a makeshift camp in Belgium, he spent the spring of 1944 in a compound filled with other Luftwaffe personnel. It was there, listening to BBC radio reports, tolerated by the guards, and talking to newly captured pilots, that he grasped the full scale of the disaster. One evening in late May, a new group of captured airmen arrived. Among them was a young Unteroffizier, barely 19, from JG2. His eyes still held the shock of his recent shoot-down. Over a shared cigarette, the boy described his mission. "We were scrambled from Caen to attack landing craft. We never got near the coast. Mustangs, they were everywhere like a swarm of hornets. They shot down our leader in the first pass. I tried to run, but one just followed me down. He shot out my engine. I was lucky to bail out." Baumann asked, "How many of you got through?" The boy looked at the ground. "I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 out of 12. They say it's like that every day now." Later that night, Baumann lay on his bunk, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling. He thought of Hartmann, of Voss, of the arrogant certainty of that morning in December. He thought of the yellow-nosed Mustang and the pilot's nod. That nod hadn't just been about one victory. It had been a preview of the future. The expert and the aces, with their finely honed skills and warrior ethos, had been rendered obsolete not by better warriors, but by a system, a vast, impersonal, grinding system of factories, engineers, and trained technicians. The Americans had not beaten the Luftwaffe in the sky. They had beaten it on the factory floor, in the design office, and in the training manual. The war in the air had become a war of attrition, and Germany had run out of things to attrit. The war ground on, but the outcome had been decided in those crucial months at the turn of 1943/44. The P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt became the omnipresent lords of the European sky. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Luftwaffe was a phantom. Its fuel was gone, its airfields destroyed, its veteran pilots dead or in cages, its new pilots sent up in hopeless, last-ditch missions with only hours of training. The final, statistical epitaph for the struggle is staggering. Between January 1944 and May 1945, the USAAF's 8th and 9th Air Forces would claim the destruction of 91 German aircraft in aerial combat over Western Europe. The vast majority of these were shot down by escort fighters. The P-51 alone was credited with 4950 of those kills. In return, 2520 Mustangs were lost to all causes, flak, accidents, and enemy fighters. The kill-to-loss ratio was better than 2:1. But more telling is the production comparison. The United States built 15,875 P-51s of all variants during the war. Germany, in that same period, managed to produce approximately 33,000 aircraft of all types: fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance. The Mustang outnumbered the entire wartime output of the German aircraft industry by half. For the men who had been on the receiving end, the post-war reflections were filled with a rueful, reluctant respect. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, in his memoirs, wrote, "The day we saw the first Mustangs over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. We could fight against the bombers, or we could fight against the escorts, but we could not fight against both. And the Mustang could do what no other enemy fighter had been able to do. It could follow us home." An unknown German flight engineer, captured in April 1945, put it more bluntly during an interrogation. "You did not have a secret weapon. You had a secret factory. We would look at the wreckage of a P-51 and think, this is a masterpiece, it must take months to build. Then we would hear that your factories were building one every hour. How do you fight against that? You are not fighting an army, you are fighting a tide. Dieter Baumann survived the war. He was repatriated to a shattered Germany in 1947. He found work as a clerk, then later as a draftsman. He never flew again. Sometimes, on a clear morning, he would look up at the sky and remember the feeling of the stick in his hand, the roar of the Daimler-Benz engine, the boundless confidence of youth. Then he would remember the drone of the Merlin, the ripping sound of the 50 calibers, and the sight of those endless formations of Mustangs, gleaming in the sun, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. They had not just defeated him, they had erased the world he knew. The turning point had not been a battle or a campaign. It had been a moment of technological and industrial clarity, delivered on the wings of a long-nosed, beautiful, and utterly merciless machine. And he had been among the first to see it coming, and to understand in his gut that there was no defense against the future when it finally arrived.